January 17, 1946. Atsugi Airfield, Japan. The wind came cold across the tarmac that morning, carrying with it the scent of salt from Tokyo Bay and the acrid residue of years of war. The sky hung low and grey, pregnant with the weight of a winter that seemed to stretch endlessly across the devastated landscape of the Japanese home islands. On the concrete apron of what had once been one of the Imperial Japanese Navy's most prestigious air stations, a small group of men stood in formation, their uniforms threadbare, their faces gaunt with the hollowness that comes not from hunger alone, but from the complete collapse of everything they had once believed to be eternal and unshakable. These were not common soldiers. These were officers of the Imperial Japanese Navy Air Service, men who had once commanded squadrons of Zero fighters across the vast expanse of the Pacific, who had led bombing raids against Allied positions from Pearl Harbor to the Coral Sea, who had been taught from childhood that death in service to the Emperor was the highest honor a man could achieve. Now they stood as prisoners, though the Americans did not call them that. The war had ended 5 months earlier, but for these men, time had ceased to have meaning on August 15, 1945, when the Emperor's voice crackled over radio speakers across the nation, speaking words that should have been impossible. Surrender. The sound of approaching engines drew their attention. American transport trucks rumbled across the airfield, and behind them, the distinctive silhouette of a C-47 transport aircraft touched down on the runway, its tires squealing against concrete that still bore the scars of B-29 bombing raids. The Japanese officers stiffened instinctively, decades of military discipline overriding the exhaustion and despair that had settled into their bones. They expected many things in that moment. They expected humiliation, perhaps. They expected the rough justice they had seen meted out in newsreels of German officers being marched through ruined cities. They expected, at the very least, the cold indifference of victors toward the vanquished. What they did not expect was coffee. The first American pilot who approached them was young, perhaps 23 or 24, with the easy stride of someone who had never known defeat, never watched his homeland burn, never felt the foundations of his entire worldview crumble beneath his feet. He carried a metal thermos in one hand and a stack of tin cups in the other. Behind him, other American servicemen emerged from the trucks, and they too carried thermoses along with wooden crates that gave off the unmistakable aroma of freshly brewed coffee mixed with something else: sugar, cream, food. Commander Minoru Genda stood at the front of the Japanese formation. At 36, he was one of the most brilliant tactical minds the Imperial Navy had ever produced, the principal planner of the attack on Pearl Harbor, a man whose strategies had been studied and admired even by his enemies. He had flown combat missions until 1944, when he was finally pulled from frontline service to train the next generation of pilots, young men who would become kamikaze, human bombs thrown against the inexorable advance of American naval power. He had watched Japan's carefully constructed empire collapse piece by piece, island by island, city by city, until there was nothing left but the smoldering ruins of the home islands and the bitter knowledge that everything he had fought for had been built on miscalculation and delusion. The American pilot stopped directly in front of Genda and extended the thermos toward him. "Coffee, sir," he said in English, his voice carrying no trace of mockery, no edge of triumph. Just a simple offer, as if they were colleagues meeting at a training exercise rather than victor and vanquished standing amid the wreckage of total war. Genda stared at the thermos. For a long moment, he did not move. Behind him, he could sense the confusion radiating from his fellow officers, men who had been prepared for anything except kindness. The silence stretched out, broken only by the wind and the distant sound of reconstruction work being carried out by American engineers across the base. Then, slowly, Genda reached out and took the cup the American offered, his hand trembling slightly, whether from cold, malnutrition, or emotion. He could not have said. The American poured the coffee, steam rising in delicate spirals against the grey sky. Genda held the cup in both hands, feeling the warmth seep into his palms, and that simple sensation: heat, comfort, the ordinary mercy of a hot drink on a cold day, broke something inside him that 4 years of warfare had not managed to touch. The first tear traced a path down his weathered face before he could stop it. Then another, and another. Around him, other Japanese officers were receiving their own cups of coffee, and on face after face, the same transformation occurred. Men who had faced death without flinching, who had sent countless subordinates to their deaths without visible emotion, who had been trained since childhood to suppress all weakness, found themselves weeping openly as American pilots moved among them, pouring coffee, offering cigarettes, speaking in halting Japanese or gesturing with the universal language of shared humanity. Lieutenant Commander Mitsuo Fukuda stood 3 places down from Gender. He had led the first wave of aircraft against Pearl Harbor on December 7, 1941, had transmitted the code words Tora, Tora, Tora. That signal complete surprise had been achieved, had watched with satisfaction as American battleships burned and capsized in the early morning light. He had believed in that moment that Japan had struck a blow from which the United States could never recover, that the spiritual strength of the Japanese warrior would always triumph over the material decadence of the West. Now, holding a cup of American coffee in his shaking hands, breathing in its rich aroma, feeling its warmth spread through his malnourished body, he understood with sudden and absolute clarity how completely he had misjudged everything. This was not the act of a defeated or weakened enemy. This was not the behavior of a nation brought to its knees by Japan's initial victories. This was abundance made casual, generosity extended without calculation, the fundamental assumption that there was enough coffee, enough food, enough resources, enough humanity to share even with those who had sought America's destruction. Fukuda had studied American capabilities before the war. He had read intelligence reports about industrial production, agricultural output, economic strength, but numbers on paper had seemed abstract, meaningless compared to the fierce certainty of Japanese spiritual superiority. Now, in the simple act of receiving coffee from an enemy who had every right to hate him, he confronted the reality those numbers had represented: a nation so vast, so productive, so fundamentally different in its assumptions about the world, that it could wage total war across 2 oceans simultaneously and still have enough surplus to show mercy to its defeated foes. The tears that ran down Fukuda's face were not merely tears of relief or exhaustion, though both played their part. They were tears of recognition, of understanding arriving too late, of confronting the magnitude of the delusion under which he and his fellow officers had operated. Japan had gone to war believing in its own mythology, in the superiority of spirit over matter, in the divine wind that would protect the homeland, in the unshakable loyalty of its people to the emperor and the nation. And America had responded not with matching fervor, but with something far more devastating, systematic, abundant, almost casual superiority in every material dimension of modern warfare, combined with a fundamental generosity that seemed to flow from some inexhaustible source. The origins of this moment, this quiet morning on a damaged airfield when coffee became revelation, lay years earlier, in the calculations and miscalculations that had led both nations to war in the late 1930s, as Japan expanded its control over Manchuria and pushed deeper into China. A faction within the Imperial Japanese Navy began serious planning for a potential conflict with the United States. These men were not fools or fanatics, though history would sometimes paint them as such. They were professionals who understood, at least intellectually, the vast disparity in resources between their island nation and the American colossus. Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto, who would eventually command the combined fleet and plan the attack on Pearl Harbor, had spent years in the United States, first as a student at Harvard and later as a naval attach. He had traveled across America, had seen the oil fields of Texas, the steel mills of Pittsburgh, the automobile factories of Detroit. He had walked the streets of American cities and understood something fundamental about the nation's character. It was not a warrior culture, but it was something potentially more dangerous, an industrial civilization of unimaginable productive capacity. Yamamoto had warned his political masters that war with America would be catastrophic. "I shall run wild for 6 months or a year," he told Prime Minister Kono in 1940, "but I have utterly no confidence for the 2nd or 3rd year." This was not modesty or pessimism. It was mathematical reality. Japan produced approximately 7 million tons of steel per year. The United States produced 75 million tons. Japan had access to limited oil reserves, mostly from recently conquered territories in the Dutch East Indies. America produced more than 60% of the world's petroleum. The industrial capacity ratio was roughly 10 to 1 in America's favor, and that was before considering the vast agricultural abundance that meant American soldiers would never go hungry. American workers would never lack food. American civilians would support the war effort without experiencing the desperation of true shortage. But numbers alone had not conveyed the truth. Japanese military doctrine, shaped by centuries of samurai tradition and decades of victory against Western powers in limited conflicts, emphasized spiritual factors over material ones. The Battle of Tsushima in 1905, in which the Japanese Navy annihilated a Russian fleet, had become a national mythology, proof that Japanese warriors could overcome any obstacle through superior discipline, training, and willingness to sacrifice. The successful invasions of Manchuria and China, though they met fierce resistance, had reinforced this belief. Japanese officers studied Bushido, the way of the warrior, which taught that death before dishonor was the highest virtue, that acceptance of one's mortality freed a warrior to fight with supernatural effectiveness. Against this spiritual certainty, the material calculations of economists and logistics officers seemed weak, almost treasonous. The decision to attack Pearl Harbor emerged from this fundamental disconnect between reality and belief. Japanese planners understood they could not win a long war against the United States. Therefore, they would not fight a long war. They would strike a devastating blow, cripple the American Pacific Fleet, seize the resource-rich territories of Southeast Asia, and force America to accept a negotiated peace. The Americans, soft and materialistic, would surely not have the stomach for the sacrifices necessary to reconquer territories thousands of miles from their homeland. They would accept the new reality, and Japan would secure its greater East Asia Sea prosperity sphere. This plan was built on multiple layers of delusion, but the deepest and most consequential was the misunderstanding of American character. Japanese planners saw American democracy as weakness, saw its consumer culture as decadence, saw its heterogeneous population as a source of division rather than strength. They failed to understand that a nation built on the idea that ordinary people deserved prosperity, that individual liberty was worth defending, that government existed to serve the people rather than the other way around, would fight with a different kind of determination than any Bushido code could produce. They failed to understand that American abundance was not a sign of soft living, but the result of a system that unleashed human productivity in ways that feudal or militaristic societies could never match. When the first wave of Japanese aircraft approached Pearl Harbor on the morning of December 7, 1941, the pilots looked down on a scene that should have vindicated their beliefs. American sailors were sleeping in their bunks, unprepared for war. American ships sat at anchor like targets in a shooting gallery, neatly arranged for maximum destruction. The attack achieved tactical surprise so complete it seemed to prove Japanese superiority. Commander Fuchida, leading the attack, felt elation as he surveyed the devastation below: burning ships, exploding ammunition, chaos and destruction on a scale that surely would shock America into despair. What Fuchida and his fellow pilots did not see, could not see from their aircraft, was what happened next. They did not see the American sailors who, instead of panicking, rushed to their battle stations even as their ships sank beneath them. They did not see the mechanics and engineers who immediately began planning salvage operations, who would raise and repair ships that Japanese intelligence would mark as permanent losses. They did not see the rage that swept across America, the overnight transformation from an isolationist nation reluctant to enter foreign wars into a unified colossus determined to achieve total victory. And they certainly did not understand the industrial and agricultural capacity that rage would unleash. In the 6 months after Pearl Harbor, Japan did indeed run wild, exactly as Yamamoto had predicted. Japanese forces captured Hong Kong, Malaya, Singapore, the Dutch East Indies, the Philippines, Wake Island, and pushed deep into Burma. The greater East Asia Sea prosperity sphere seemed to be achieving reality. But even as Japanese armies advanced, the American response was already taking shape, and it was a response that no amount of Bushido spirit could counter. In shipyards across America, a construction program began that would have seemed impossible to Japanese planners. The Essex-class aircraft carrier program, already underway before Pearl Harbor, accelerated. The United States would eventually build 24 of these massive ships, each one representing industrial capacity greater than entire sectors of the Japanese economy. But carriers were only the beginning. Escort carriers, built on merchant ship hulls, came off production lines at a rate of nearly 1 per week at peak production. Liberty ships, the mass-produced cargo vessels that would carry American supplies across the world, were being built so rapidly that some were completed in less than 5 days from keel laying to launch. Aircraft production told the same story. In 1941, Japan produced approximately 5,000 military aircraft. American production that same year was roughly 19,000. By 1944, Japan would struggle to produce 28,000 aircraft with declining quality and chronic shortages of fuel and trained pilots. America would produce more than 96,000 aircraft in 1944 alone, and they would be technologically superior to most of their Japanese counterparts. Flown by pilots who had benefited from extensive training that Japan could no longer afford to provide. The P-51 Mustang, the F-6F Hellcat, the B-29 Superfortress each represented not just engineering excellence, but a system that could design, test, produce, and deploy advanced technology at scale while simultaneously maintaining quality and improving performance. But it was not merely the weapons and machines that demonstrated American capacity. It was everything else. The entire infrastructure of warfare that Japan had never managed to fully grasp. American submarines prowled the Pacific, sinking Japanese merchant vessels at a rate that eventually strangled the home islands. By 1945, Japan faced genuine starvation, with food rationing reduced to barely subsistence levels. Meanwhile, American servicemen, even those in forward combat positions, ate better than most Japanese civilians had eaten before the war. C rations, K rations, and field kitchens provided approximately 4,000 calories per day to American combat troops. Not gourmet food, certainly, but abundant, nutritious, and reliable. American soldiers complained about the food, as soldiers always do, never realizing that their complaints about monotony and blandness would have seemed like insane luxury to their Japanese counterparts, who were often reduced to eating tree bark and grass. This abundance extended into every aspect of the American war effort. Medical care for wounded soldiers reached unprecedented levels of effectiveness, with survival rates from battlefield injuries far exceeding those of previous wars. American logistics operations could supply forward units across thousands of miles of ocean with remarkable reliability. American engineering battalions built airfields, roads, and harbors with astonishing speed. And behind it all, American agriculture produced such surplus that the nation could feed not only its own people and military, but also ship food to Britain, the Soviet Union, and other allies under the Lend-Lease program. Japanese officers, reading intelligence reports about American capabilities, often dismissed them as exaggeration or propaganda. The numbers seemed impossible. How could one nation produce so much? How could American workers maintain such productivity while their soldiers fought on distant battlefields? The answer lay in systems and assumptions that Japanese military culture could not comprehend. American industrial workers were not conscripts or slaves, but free laborers earning high wages, motivated by both patriotism and personal interest. American farmers used mechanized agriculture on a scale that made Japanese rice farming seem medieval by comparison. American scientists and engineers operated within a culture that rewarded innovation and unconventional thinking, rather than rigid adherence to hierarchy and tradition. As the war progressed and Japan's position deteriorated, some Japanese officers began to grasp the magnitude of their miscalculation. Commander Genda, after being wounded in air combat over the Marianas in 1944, spent time training kamikaze pilots, young men barely out of school who were being sent to die in desperate attacks that might sink one ship if they were lucky. He watched them take off on their final missions, and he understood what this represented. Japan had run out of conventional options. The kamikaze was not a tactic born of strength, but of complete material bankruptcy. When a nation must turn its pilots into guided bombs because it lacks the aircraft, fuel, and trained personnel to fight conventionally, it has already lost. The kamikaze, presented to the Japanese public as the ultimate expression of Yamado Danmachi, the spirit of Japan, was in reality a confession of defeat, an admission that spirit alone could not overcome the material realities of modern industrial warfare. The firebombing of Tokyo in March 1945 brought those realities home in the most literal sense. American B-29 bombers, operating from bases in the Marianas that Japan no longer had the capacity to threaten, dropped thousands of tons of incendiary bombs on the Japanese capital. The resulting firestorm killed more than 100,000 people in a single night, destroyed 16 square miles of the city, and left more than 1 million people homeless. This was not the result of a few lucky hits or a momentary advantage. This was systematic destruction carried out by an enemy who had such complete air superiority that Japanese fighters barely managed to intercept the attacking bombers. Night. after night, American bombers returned, targeting city after city, until much of urban Japan was simply gone, burned away by a form of warfare that Japanese PI war planners had never seriously contemplated. And then came the atomic bombs. Hiroshima on August 6th, Nagasaki on August 9th, the Emperor's unprecedented radio address on August 15th, surrender for Japanese officers like Genda and Fukuda. The period between August 15th and the actual arrival of American occupation forces was a time of profound psychological crisis. They had been taught that death was preferable to surrender, that the loss of honor was the ultimate shame. Many officers committed seppuku, ritual suicide, rather than face occupation. Others contemplated it but held back, paralyzed by the collision between their training and the reality of what surrender would mean. They expected the Americans to behave as they themselves had often behaved in conquered territories, with brutality, exploitation, and vengeance. They expected humiliation and harsh punishment. They prepared themselves mentally for the worst. The Americans who arrived at Atsugi and other bases across Japan in the fall of 1945 were not saints or angels. They were young men, mostly, who had fought a brutal war across the Pacific, who had lost friends and comrades, who had every reason to harbor hatred for their Japanese enemies. Many American servicemen did harbor such hatred. They had seen the aftermath of the Bataan Death March, had heard stories of American prisoners tortured and starved in Japanese POW camps, had fought desperate battles against enemy soldiers who refused to surrender and often preferred to die taking Americans with them. The Pacific War had been particularly savage, characterized by a level of racial hatred and dehumanization that exceeded even the brutal European theater. American propaganda had portrayed the Japanese as subhuman monsters. Japanese propaganda had portrayed Americans as demonic barbarians. Neither side had been inclined toward mercy, yet something remarkable happened when American forces began the occupation of Japan. The official policy, directed by General Douglas MacArthur, was to treat the Japanese with respect while implementing fundamental reforms. MacArthur understood that occupying a hostile population of 70 million people scattered across thousands of islands would be impossible if the occupation relied solely on force. He needed Japanese cooperation, which meant he needed to avoid the kind of vindictive punishment that might turn occupation into endless guerrilla warfare. But policy alone does not explain what happened at Atsugi and countless other locations across occupied Japan. The American servicemen who offered coffee to defeated Japanese officers were acting on something deeper than orders or policy. They were acting on assumptions so fundamental to American culture that they seemed like common sense rather than ideology. In American understanding, people were not fundamentally defined by their nationality or their government. People were individuals capable of change, worthy of basic dignity regardless of their past. The war had been against Japanese militarism, not against Japanese people. Now that the militarism was defeated, there was no reason to continue hatred. This logic would have seemed bizarre to Japanese officers raised in a culture where national identity and individual identity were inseparable, where the emperor was a living god and service to the nation was the highest possible value. But to the Americans, it was simply obvious. The war was over. These men were hungry and cold, and sharing coffee cost nothing. Private First Class Robert Morrison, the young pilot who had offered coffee to Commander Genda, had lost his older brother at Guadalcanal. He had every personal reason to hate the Japanese, but when he looked at the gaunt faces of the Japanese officers standing on the windswept tarmac, what he saw were not monsters but exhausted, defeated men who looked disturbingly similar to his own father after a long day of farm work back in Iowa. Morrison had been raised in a culture that valued generosity, that taught him to help those in need, that assumed abundance was normal and hoarding was shameful. The thermoses of coffee his unit had prepared that morning were not a calculated gesture of psychological warfare, though they would prove more effective at winning Japanese cooperation than any threat could have been. They were simply what you did when you saw people who needed help. This casual generosity, repeated in thousands of interactions across occupied Japan, had a profound impact on Japanese psychology. The officers who wept at Atsugi were not weeping merely from relief or exhaustion. They were weeping from the sudden collapse of their entire understanding of the war and the enemy they had fought. Every assumption they had made had been wrong. The Americans were not weak or decadent. The Americans were not cruel or vengeful, despite having every justification for vengeance. The Americans possessed a kind of strength that had nothing to do with Bushido or military discipline, the strength of a system that produced such abundance that sharing seemed more natural than hoarding, the strength of a social philosophy that saw enemies as redeemable rather than eternal, the strength of an economy so robust that even total war had not exhausted it. Commander Fukida, standing on the Otsuki tarmac with tears streaming down his face and a cup of American coffee warming his hands, experienced what he would later describe as a spiritual awakening. He had led the attack on Pearl Harbor, believing he was striking a blow for Japanese honor and Asian independence from Western imperialism. He had fought for 4 years, believing that Japanese spiritual superiority would ultimately prevail. Now, in a single morning, in the simple act of receiving unexpected kindness from the enemy he had attacked, his entire worldview inverted. The Americans, he suddenly understood, had not been fighting for empire or racial dominance. They had been fighting for something else, something he was only beginning to grasp, a vision of the world where abundance was possible, where individuals mattered, where yesterday's enemy could become tomorrow's friend. The coffee itself became symbolic in Fukida's mind, and in the minds of many other Japanese officers who experienced similar moments in the early days of occupation. Coffee was not a Japanese drink. It was exotic, foreign, expensive. Most Japanese civilians had rarely tasted it even before the war, and during the war years of severe rationing, it had become virtually unobtainable. Yet here were the Americans, distributing it freely to defeated enemy officers, not as a show of dominance, but as a simple gesture of human kindness. The coffee represented everything about American material culture that Japanese propaganda had portrayed as weakness: the focus on comfort, the assumption of abundance, the casual generosity, but which turned out to be sources of tremendous strength. In the weeks and months that followed, this pattern repeated across Japan. American troops distributed food to starving civilians. American engineers rebuilt infrastructure. American doctors treated Japanese patients. American teachers began working with Japanese educators to reform the school system. American administrators implemented democratic reforms while deliberately preserving the emperor as a constitutional monarch, understanding that this compromise was necessary for social stability. None of this was perfect or without problems. The occupation was not a fairy tale, and genuine grievances and difficulties emerged, but the overall character of the occupation, remarkably benign by historical standards, focused on reconstruction rather than punishment, guided by the assumption that Japan could and should become a democratic partner rather than a subjugated enemy, contradicted everything Japanese propaganda had taught about American intentions. Commander Genda, who had expected humiliation and possible execution as one of the chief planners of Pearl Harbor, instead found himself consulted by American officers interested in understanding Japanese naval aviation tactics. The Americans treated him as a professional colleague who happened to have been on the opposing side, not as a war criminal. This professional respect, combined with the material generosity he witnessed daily, transformed his understanding not just of America but of the war itself. Japan had not lost because the Japanese people lacked courage or commitment. Japan had lost because it had fundamentally misunderstood the nature of modern warfare and the character of its opponent. Bushido was not meaningless. Courage and discipline remained valuable, but they were not sufficient. Material abundance, technological innovation, social systems that empowered individuals rather than crushing them into rigid hierarchies, these factors which Japanese culture had dismissed as Western weakness, turned out to be the foundations of strength in the modern world. Fukida's transformation went even further. In the years after the war, he would become a Christian missionary, traveling across Japan and eventually to the United States, preaching a message of reconciliation and redemption. His conversion was motivated partly by spiritual factors. He was deeply moved by the story of a young American woman, Margaret Covell, who returned to Japan as a missionary despite the fact that her missionary parents had been killed by Japanese soldiers. But the foundation for his spiritual transformation was laid that morning at Otsuki, when American kindness broke through the barriers of ideology and propaganda and forced him to confront the reality of what he had been fighting for and against. The psychological impact of the occupation on Japanese society extended far beyond individual officers. For 4 years, Japanese civilians had been told that the Americans were devils who would commit unspeakable atrocities if they won. They had been prepared for rape, murder, and enslavement. Instead, they encountered occupiers who handed out chocolate to children, who were curious about Japanese culture, who tried often incompetently to speak Japanese, who seemed genuinely interested in helping Japan recover. This disconnect between expectation and reality created a psychological opening for the dramatic reforms that MacArthur and his staff implemented. The new Japanese Constitution, drafted under American supervision and enacted in 1947, was built on principles that would have been unthinkable in pre-war Japan. Popular sovereignty replaced imperial sovereignty. Women gained the right to vote. Land reform broke up the great estates that had kept rural Japanese in poverty. Labor unions were legalized. The military was abolished, replaced by a self-defense force explicitly prohibited from offensive warfare. Education was reformed to emphasize critical thinking and individual development rather than nationalist indoctrination. These were revolutionary changes, the kind of social transformation that typically requires generations. They were accepted not without resistance, but without the massive popular uprising that might have been expected, largely because the occupation had established a fundamental credibility. The Americans had proven they were not the devils of propaganda. Therefore, perhaps the American ideas about democracy and individual rights deserved consideration. The economic miracle that followed, turning Japan from a devastated, defeated nation into an economic powerhouse within a generation, vindicated this openness to change. Japanese capitalism, operating within a democratic framework and benefiting from American investment and access to American markets, proved far more successful at generating prosperity than the militaristic empire had ever been. The soldiers, who had died believing they were defending Japan's future, had actually been defending a system that impoverished and enslaved their own people. The Americans, who had seemed to be Japan's enemies, had actually offered liberation not from Japanese culture or identity, but from the militaristic ideology that had led Japan into catastrophic war. The coffee at Atsugi was not merely coffee. It was revelation. It was the moment when theory met reality, when ideology confronted facts, when the mythology that had sustained 4 years of total war collapsed under the weight of simple human kindness. For the American servicemen who dispensed that coffee, it was an ordinary morning, a minor task in the vast machinery of occupation and reconstruction. They did not understand the profound impact of their actions. Most of them never knew that Japanese officers wept at receiving something as simple as a hot drink. They were just following their own instincts about how to treat other human beings, instincts shaped by a culture that, for all its flaws and contradictions, fundamentally assumed that abundance was normal, that generosity was practical, that yesterday's enemy did not have to be tomorrow's enemy. For the Japanese officers, it was a morning that divided their lives into before and after. Before, they had been samurai in service to the emperor, warriors defined by their willingness to die, believers in an ideology that promised victory through spiritual purity. After, they were something else, men confronting the wreckage of their beliefs, forced to rebuild their understanding of the world from the ground up, beginning with the simple recognition that they had been wrong about nearly everything that mattered. The tears that flowed on the Atsugi tarmac were not tears of weakness. They were tears of transformation, the painful tears that come when a lifetime of certainty dissolves in the face of undeniable reality. They were tears of recognition that all the sacrifices, all the deaths, all the suffering had been in service of a delusion. They were tears of grief for what had been lost and could never be recovered. But they were also, in some strange way, tears of relief. The war was truly over. The future, whatever it held, would be different from the past. And standing in the cold wind with warming hands wrapped around cups of American coffee, these officers who had been prepared to die rather than surrender found themselves, against all expectation, glad to be a live dot in the years that followed. Many of these officers would build new lives in the transformed Japan that emerged from occupation. Gender would eventually serve in the Japanese self-defense force, reaching the rank of general and serving in the Japanese Diet. His expertise in military aviation, once directed toward destroying American power, would be redirected toward building a defensive force aligned with American strategic interests. Fukuda would travel the world preaching reconciliation, telling the story of Pearl Harbor from the perspective of someone who had come to see it as a tragic mistake rather than a glorious attack. Others would enter business, education, or civilian government service, helping to build the democratic Japan that would become one of America's closest allies. This transformation from fanatical warriors willing to die for the emperor to citizens of a peaceful democracy was not instantaneous or universal. Some Japanese never accepted it, clinging to PR ideology until death. But for those who experienced that moment of revelation, when American abundance and generosity shattered their assumptions about the war and the enemy, transformation became possible in ways that would have been unimaginable in 1941. The coffee at Otsugi represented something larger than individual kindness or effective occupation policy. It represented the victory of one set of assumptions about human nature and social organization over another. The Japanese military had built its ideology on the assumption that life was fundamentally about struggle, that resources were scarce and had to be seized by force, that hierarchy and obedience were necessary for survival, that individual desires must be crushed in service to collective goals. The Americans, often without articulating it consciously, operated on different assumptions, that abundance was achievable through the right economic and political systems, that individual freedom was not only morally right, but practically beneficial, that cooperation and trade were more effective than conquest, that people were capable of change and redemption. Neither set of assumptions was purely or perfectly embodied by either nation. America had its own history of conquest and oppression. Japan had rich cultural traditions of art, philosophy, and community that existed alongside and sometimes in tension with militarism. But in the context of World War II and its aftermath, these competing visions of how societies should organize themselves met in direct conflict, and the outcome was decisive. The militaristic, hierarchical, spiritually focused Japanese system lost not just militarily but ideologically. The democratic, individualistic, materialistically abundant American system proved superior not only in its capacity to wage war but in its capacity to win peace. The tears at Otsugi were the moment when this truth became undeniable to some of the men who had been most committed to the losing ideology. They had fought with extraordinary courage for a system that promised them glory and delivered only defeat. They had sacrificed everything for beliefs that proved to be illusions. And then, when they were most vulnerable, most defeated, most prepared for the vengeance they expected and perhaps believed they deserved, they received instead a cup of coffee, warm, abundant, freely given, and in that simple gesture, they glimpsed a different way of understanding the world. The epilogue to this story extends beyond the individual transformations of Genda, Fukida, and the other officers present that morning. It encompasses the entire post-war transformation of Japan and the relationship between Japan and the United States. The occupation ended in 1952 with the Treaty of San Francisco, which restored Japanese sovereignty and established Japan as a key American ally in East Asia. The security treaty between the United States and Japan, signed simultaneously, provided for American military bases on Japanese soil and committed the United States to Japan's defense. This arrangement, which continues to the present day, would have been incomprehensible to the officers who planned Pearl Harbor. Japan's security guaranteed by the very nation it had attacked, Japan's prosperity built on access to American markets, and integration into an American-led economic order. This was not what Japanese militarists had envisioned when they launched their war for Asian independence from Western dominance. Yet this outcome, so different from what anyone expected in 1941, proved remarkably successful for both nations. Japan achieved prosperity and security far exceeding anything the Greater East Asia Sea Prosperity Sphere had promised. The United States gained a stable, democratic ally in a strategically crucial region. The relationship was not without tensions and disagreements, but it endured because it was built on mutual benefit rather than coercion, on shared interests rather than imperial dominance. The coffee at Otsugi, in this broader context, becomes a symbol of the moment when a different kind of peace became possible, not the peace of exhaustion or terror, but the peace of genuine transformation. The Japanese officers who wept that morning were not merely accepting defeat. They were, without fully realizing it yet, taking the first steps toward a different understanding of what strength means, what security requires, what makes a society successful. They were beginning to learn that the abundance they had dismissed as American decadence was actually the fruit of liberty, that the generosity they had not expected was actually strategic wisdom, that the democracy they had been taught to despise was actually a more effective system for organizing human society than anything the militarists had created. For Americans, the occupation of Japan represented both the culmination of military victory and a test of national character. Would America, having achieved total victory over an enemy that had attacked without warning, choose vengeance or reconstruction? Would America treat defeated Japan as Rome treated Carthage, destroying it utterly to prevent future threat? Or would America attempt something unprecedented, transforming an enemy into a friend through a combination of force, reform, and generosity? The decision to choose the latter course was not inevitable or uncontroversial. Many Americans wanted harsh punishment for Japan, but the policy that prevailed reflected deeper American assumptions about human nature and social possibility. The belief that people could change, that systems mattered more than immutable national character, that abundance shared was more secure than abundance hoarded. The success of this approach in Japan, combined with the parallel success of the Marshall Plan in Europe, established a model for American power in the post-war world, a model built not merely on military dominance, but on economic integration, political reform, and the spread of democratic institutions. This model was not always followed consistently, and American Cold War policies included support for authoritarian regimes and military interventions that contradicted the ideals of the occupation. But the occupation of Japan remained a proof of concept. Enemies could become allies. Defeated nations could become prosperous democracies, and the investment in reconstruction and reform could yield security and prosperity that military occupation alone could never achieve. The officers who received coffee at Atsugi lived long enough to see this transformation complete. Genda died in 1989, having spent his final decades as an advocate for Japanese democracy and the Oz-Japan Alliance. Fukida died in 1976, having devoted 30 years to Christian missionary work and reconciliation between former enemies. Both men, in their different ways, testify to the power of that morning in January 1946, when the simplest of gestures, a cup of coffee offered to a defeated enemy, began a process of transformation that neither the planners of Pearl Harbor nor the architects of American victory could have predicted. In the end, the tears shed at Atsugi were tears of recognition. Recognition that courage alone is not enough if it serves a flawed vision. Recognition that material abundance is not weakness but strength. Recognition that the enemy you demonized is, after all, human. Recognition that defeat can be a beginning rather than an ending. Recognition that the world is larger and more complex than any single ideology can capture. Recognition that change is possible, even when it seems impossible. The coffee grew cold in their hands as they stood on the windswept tarmac. But the warmth remained, not just the physical warmth of the drink, but the warmth of the gesture, the warmth of unexpected humanity in the aftermath of inhuman war. That warmth would sustain these men through the difficult years of reconstruction and transformation ahead. It would be a memory they returned to when the future seemed uncertain, when the old certainties pulled at them, when the magnitude of change seemed overwhelming. They had been prepared for many things that morning. They had been prepared for humiliation, for punishment, for the bitter taste of complete defeat. They had not been prepared for kindness, and that kindness, more than all the military might, that had brought them to that moment, proved the decisive weapon in a war they had not known. They were fighting the war for the future, the war to determine what kind of world would emerge from the ashes of the old. The coffee was just coffee, and the coffee was everything. It was the taste of abundance in the mouth of scarcity. It was the warmth of human connection in the cold wind of defeat. It was the symbol of a different way of being in the world, a way that promised not glory through sacrifice, but prosperity through cooperation, not dominance through strength, but security through partnership. The Japanese officers who tasted it that morning tasted the future, and though it was bitter with the knowledge of all they had lost, it was also unexpectedly, hopefully, rich with the promise of what might yet be built. And so they wept for the past that was gone, for the illusions that had shattered, for the comrades who had died in service to a vision that had proven false. But also, though they might not have recognized it yet, they wept with something like relief. The war was over. The ideology that had demanded everything from them and given nothing but suffering in return was finished. And ahead, in the uncertain, but no longer terrifying future, there was coffee, there was warmth, there was the possibility, however fragile and strange, of rebuilding something better from the ruins of what had been destroyed. They had gone to war believing that death was more honorable than surrender. They stood now as living proof that surrender to truth is wiser than death in service to delusion. And in that recognition, painful as it was, lay the seed of wisdom that would shape the rest of their lives and the future of their nation. The morning stretched on. More coffee was poured. More Japanese officers arriving from other locations experienced the same shock of unexpected generosity. And gradually, amid the ruins of Otsuki Airfield, under a grey winter sky, in the presence of yesterday's enemies sharing today's coffee, the future began.